hello and welcome to Karan Mahajan, who's just written this fabulous new book, The Complex. Welcome to Book Talk for the New Indian Express, Karan. And it really struck me. One, of course, your obsession, magnificent obsession with Delhi, a city I think that you left behind when you were 17, but I think have chosen to come back to again and again. That's one. And then, of course, we'll talk about the characters and what they represent. It's like a confederacy of small men and unfulfilled women. And it's so tragic, but of course, it also epitomizes the times that we lived in. And thank you for bringing them back, because I think this is a generation that chooses to forget some of the ugliness or lots of the ugliness of the late 80s. So, middle 80s and late 80s. While the world seemingly was progressing towards progress and liberalism, we were retreating. And I think we've been retreating ever since. So, Karan, thank you so much. Let's talk about Delhi first.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question as to why it is such a sort of focal point of obsession for me. I think some of it is just the way the mentality of writers is formed, which is that the part of your life that existed before you declared yourself a writer is the most unprocessed and the most unfiltered. So, um, you have all this material that you want to essentially come back to and get deeper into and understand. And everything that you experience in that period of your life is charged with meaning. So, for example, in this novel, I was 6 years old when the Mandal Commission protests happened. Basically remember that school was closed for 2 weeks. And I have this one image from that time, which is that there was a family friend who was in college and he lay down in front of a bus. But that image itself just was enough to spark, hundreds of pages of interest from me into the Mandal Commission protest to just understand where that comes from. So I think that's one. And then the other is that, I don't know where you're based at the moment, but
In
obviously
Delhi.
in Delhi, right? For many years, Delhi was underrepresented in Indian literature. Now, actually, I think it's interestingly changed. I think I'm
That's
thinking of
true.
even Arundhati Roy's new memoir is mostly Delhi. Kiran Desai's new novel has a lot of Delhi in it. Atish Tasir. There's just a lot of people who write about it. But I think Bombay was so dominant that there was a real pleasure in mining this kind of Delhi. And also, I think there's something particular about Punjabi Delhi for me, in which I grew up, which is that on the surface, a kind of boisterous, performative culture, but also one famously that has lots of silences. And there is a desire
And
on my
deeply
part to kind of cut through it.
misogynistic, Karan. Deeply, deeply
Deeply
misogynistic.
misogynistic. Yeah. Like, Delhi had the worst male female sex ratio at one
Yeah.
point, right? Um, and that too, I think, is something that I witnessed and experienced as a boy growing up in Delhi, in a largely Punjabi Delhi milieu, and also felt wasn't talked about. So I think the combination is so potent for a writer. And then, as you said, I keep coming back. And so I have a kind of, connection to the city, though, of course, it's not kind of the connection someone like you would have at this point. Mine is concentrated in the period that I actually lived here.
Right. And let's talk about the Punjabi family. As you said, on the surface, boisterous, happy, that whole khana pina, khate pite ghar ke culture, that whole idea of the large Punjabi family, which is uh, always happy despite the knocks it's faced and all that. But as you said, the silences and the things that are hidden in those silences. For instance, for such a long time, we didn't hear much about the partition, but the kind
Right.
of bloodshed that happened and the participation of many of these elders in these families in those riots was never talked about. And even now,
Right.
it's something that they shy away from. And this is possibly the last generation that will even hear about it. So that whole idea that and living up to, oh, my father or my grandfather suffered this during partition and he began this from nothing, and then in comparison you feel so small. So this idea
Hmm.
then this masculinity not matching up to this ideal that you have. Talk about that. And Lakshman represents it, doesn't he?
Yeah, and you touched upon an important point which I'll bring up directly, which is that much of the narrative of partition is one of victimhood, right? On both sides, that we were wronged, our property was taken away, we were hurt, our people were killed. But of course, someone had to do the killing as well, and they came from both sides. And so I think that violence definitely percolated into these families. I can't say directly how, because of course I grew up so many years after partition, but you could feel it in the kind of hardening of attitudes towards Muslims, especially, which comes definitely partly from that period of partition. Um, and, a feeling of concentrating on business and material gain over sort of other avenues of advancement. Um, and so I definitely think that that has contributed. And so, on the flip side of that, you have someone like Lakshman Chopra, who you mentioned, who is, the youngest son of this character, S.P. Chopra. He's born around partition, a little after. And for him, this father figure, who was a major figure in the independence movement, he was, retired as Reserve Bank governor, obviously fictional, was one of the drafters of the Constitution. This man has become even larger than he was at the time in his mind, and he finds that there's no way in 1980s India to recapture that kind of glory. That even entering into politics, of course, would require so many compromises, um, and he has to find a way within this great constrained life that he has to try to make himself great. And of course, he chooses all the wrong ways to do it, which means dominating women, dominating minorities, dominating other family members, and so on.
And then you have the women, they're so full of unfulfilled ambition and
Mhm.
aspiration.
Mhm.
I mean, they're all universally quite a few of them are quite smart. Say Geeta, she's a
Mhm.
smart woman. Even Karishma and Aparna, they're smart. But there's this overhang of not being able to rise to their full potential. And that's true of not just the Punjabi women of that era, but so many others as well.
And they were very interesting to write for that reason. One is that actually, when I think back, right, even at my own childhood, I realized that most of the women were actually very enterprising in terms of jobs. Like, one of my aunts started a fashion line from her own house. Someone else became a painter. Someone else became a gynecologist. They had real careers. And this particular milieu in this novel is one where, again, the women are supposed to be secondary to the men, but they have just enough freedom that they could start, their own baking business, or one could become an editor, and so on. But fundamentally, marriage and having children is what they're supposed to be participating in. And also, the other thing that they do in the novel is that I think all the characters you mentioned, Archana, Karishma, Geeta, they've all married into the family. So they actually have a more clear eyed view of what this family is like and the mythology it's building for itself. And so that gives them a kind of insight some of the other characters lack. Because the men mostly belong to the Chopra clan and are in the thrall of the myth of the great, patriarch.
And yet, the relationship between the men and the women, there's a variety of relationships that you explore. I mean, by the end of it, Sachin and Geeta seem like an ideal couple, and they start out as, or they start out as, of course, a romantic couple, but I think toward in the middle they have so many differences. But their relationships are also so flawed and fraught.
I'm very glad you mentioned Sachin and Geeta in particular because I wanted to describe a kind of marriage which, we see very often, which is like not necessarily a bad marriage, not one that is riddled with abuse, but where the two partners are a little bit disappointed with each other or are unable to communicate, or there's some distance they can't bridge, but fundamentally they like and love each other. And that is difficult to write because fundamentally, as you know, with film and books, you tend towards the most dramatic situation. So tracing their arc and showing how they misunderstand each other and then arrive at a kind of mutual understanding, which is also a form of love,
Yeah.
was very important for me because then some of the other marriages I'm showing are sort of more straightforward, bad marriages. Is one which has got an actual abusive relationship. There's Archana and Lakshman who actually have a fairly stable relationship, but one person has a lot more power and the other is unable to speak up or chooses not to speak up. And of course, I don't really get into it, but the SP Chopra dynamic with his wife would have also been strange because she's raising these nine children and obviously producing the children while he's out in the world being a great man.
Being a great man, which was the case with
Yeah,
so many of these great men. The
right,
wives were sort of just baby production machines, I guess, and you never
right,
really
right,
know what their inner life was like. And I'm sure it
right.
must have been all kinds of conflicts which were never articulated, right? Not even
I
to
don't
their own
understand.
children.
Yeah. Yeah, no, because I have one child and I, I feel overwhelmed. So to imagine raising a woman raising nine children, the children obviously are out of control. There must be a kind of hierarchy, but there's also a lot of rebelliousness. Yeah, I don't really, I mean, I think I've tried writing about this a little bit in my first novel, Family Planning, in which this minister has 13 children, but it's something I want to return to more because that's kind of why I write. It's like I always end up picking a character whose inner life I don't understand and I want to explore it. And so Lakshman is an example of that. He's in this novel a predator in many ways.
Yeah.
But I also thought,
In
okay, these
every
people are
way.
walking. Yeah, he's walking up. These people walk amongst us. They're married to people we know. They're good uncles sometimes. What's going on with this kind of person? Why does he exist? What's pulling him along?
And as you said, not just personally but professionally, and an
Right,
opportunistic predator is the worst kind of predator. I mean, a
right.
predator who believes in his cause is still, I suppose you can
No, that's
forgive
a
him
good point.
somewhat. But
Right.
here you have someone who's clearly opportunistic. I mean, nothing else works in his life, so he chooses to pour himself into politics.
Though I think the one switch I wanted to show in the novel is that there is a moment where he goes from being an opportunist to suddenly believing the ideology he's adopted, where he thinks, oh, I've become my father. Oh, I really do believe that, Hindus are being left behind, quote unquote, in this country, and that, we have to stand up for ourselves. But of course, we know as the reader that this is his inner resentment finding an external form which is palatable and acceptable. And That to me, was important because I actually think ideology does often function that way, where you kind of are feeling your way towards it, and then one day you wake up and you realize, oh wow, like this is my cause, this is who I am.
And I'm so glad you picked the late 1980s, actually, the period, the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi, then Mandal and Mandir.
Were you
That's
in Delhi? Were you in Delhi then at that time too?
well, actually, I was in Calcutta, but I mean, for
Hmm.
that period. But I returned to Delhi in 87. But I knew what was going on, obviously, and I was a
Obviously, right.
journalist by then. I'm quite old, as you can imagine. But Karan, I think this is also, as you said, Delhi is underrepresented, but this period is also underexplored, right? The Mrs.
Right.
Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi period. We don't hear or read so much about it, whereas it was the most fraught period ever, I think, in Indian politics. Everything happened then, and then
I know it's
liberalization,
crazy.
Mandir and markets.
Right, right. No, you're absolutely right because also what I wanted to show is that these events are all linked, that they're not happening in isolation because sometimes historically you can begin to think that way, but as I was writing and as I was researching, right, you see these small things. And I did this also in my last novel, Association of Small Bombs, where you realize that terrorists are also looking at each other's events and seeing this is how I'm going to plot mine in response to what I saw happening. So here, there was this whole question of how involved was the BJP, for example, in the anti-Sikh riots in Delhi. And it's an open question, but regardless, many people think that they got from that a model of how large scale riots could be inflamed and implemented, let's say later on in a place like Gujarat. And so that's a linkage that the novel gets into because Lakshman doesn't actually participate in the riots. He actually is helping his neighbors because his primary fealty is to his colony, his neighborhood, which was founded by his father. But then later on, of course, with the first Rath Yatra, he is fomenting a very similar kind of religious movement. And then the other thing that you know this because you're a journalist, but I don't think was dramatized in a novel is the connection between Mandal and the start of Hindu nationalism, which is
Right.
the way in which the BJP is supporting VP Singh from the outside. It can't openly come out against Mandal because obviously it doesn't want to openly alienate the lower castes, but it wants to divert the passions of the upper castes into the first Rath Yatra. And that kind of thing is very easy to say, but it's very hard to make the reader feel it on a personal level. So to me, that was actually the part of the novel that was most that I was happiest with as I wrote it, because that entire Mandal section towards the end came out in one sitting practically. And I remember thinking, wow, like something is really working through me. And I was like, oh, this is why I'm a writer. Like this, when this happens every once in a while, it can feel really great.
No, it is. It's wonderful. And the mechanism you use of Lakshman being the architect of the Rath is such a clever thing. How did that happen?
So, I wanted to make it clear that he's not a real historical figure, firstly, right? He's not one of the leaders of this party, which is,
Although you do
similar.
have the leaders of the party,
I do. So, and obviously the party
who
is
are
like,
not so well disguised.
well, I mean, I think the whole thing is like, that's why this is kind of a party inspired by the BJP as opposed to the BJP, because then I can take liberties, and it's true of all the other historical things. So I didn't want to get into the inner lives, let's say, of the leaders of the BJP in the early stages, but I thought, okay, this is a henchman. I can take liberties here. And also, it is kind of perfect if he is someone who has contributed something to this movement that is lasting. And that felt somehow like something he would have the creative energy to do. And also that, again, it wouldn't require me to write him into the novel as a MP or as a minister or something. And that also, again, emerged pretty organically. But
It's
I'm glad you're asking about that. It's interesting. Yeah.
because it's so interesting. And the other thing, of course, is this whole the representation of the two leaders, and we all know who they are, and the differences, and the clever sort of way that the party used them, for various things. One for to represent a milder form of their ideology, and the other was actually plotting the growth path of the party. So I like that very much. I don't think it must be making you very popular with this government, but that's okay. Um, Talk a little about the India that is now,
Hmm.
India
Hmm.
that actually emerged from.
Right, because obviously any novel you write that's set in the past is totally inflected with the concerns of the present, and that's partly why there's such an exploration of sexual violence in this novel. It wasn't being talked about as much in the 80s, but we know it was happening, and it's being talked about a lot more now. So I was interested in seeing, okay, what was it like for women to experience it at a time when, even if they were educated women, they didn't have a recourse. They couldn't, the Me Too movement or equivalent didn't exist. And then, so I obviously this is an unresolved part of Indian life. It continues to be, and it continues to occur in all these families. And the other thing I think about the India of the present is that I was always interested in, I don't know why. I had a very deep skepticism of the whole New India narrative from the beginning. Like, growing up and when I was seeing it in the 90s and 2000s, my first feeling was, oh, people's attitudes are not really changing. I think they actually have changed in many ways, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But that also, I felt that this strain of Hindu nationalism we were seeing, because I had come from this brand of Punjabi bourgeoisie, didn't feel like it was a new thing either. That, and if you go back and look at, let's say, reformist Hindu sects in the early 1900s, the conversation is already that, we invented the airplane. That stuff is not a new thing. It's coming from 1910. The minute the airplane comes around, we're saying we had it 2000 years ago. So how to show that continuity from that period, um, and make it seem that, it's not that it was all unleashed just by the demolition of, let's say, the Babri Masjid.
It was festering.
It was festering for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. You mustn't be very popular in your family, though.
No, I mean, I'm such a nice guy.
I wonder if there are people in this book who have any resemblance to the members of the family who have any resemblance to your family, and I
No,
wonder what
none
they think
whatsoever.
of
No,
it.
no. I'll plead the fifth, as they say in the US. No, the thing is, like, the part that's tricky about writing fiction, which I think a lot of fiction writers, especially realist fiction writers, grapple with, is that you often are using realistic settings. So all the settings are places that I'm deeply familiar with. Um, the milieu itself is one that I'm deeply familiar with, but I do take pains to, you know, if there's something that is kind of like seeming similar to what's happened in the family, to disguise it, and also, to essentially use composite characters. Like, what actually ends up happening is that each character is a strand of my own emotion that is exaggerated, and so it's not really ever based on anyone in that sense. But yeah, I think one of the dangers of writing fiction is that, people always think it's about you and it's about your parents or about your family. And I think there's actually ways to play with that too. I think this is why I have this thing at the beginning with Mohit Chopra
Yeah,
having sent and having left a manuscript in the
right.
draft folder, is that this instability between fact and fiction is a fascinating thing to explore.
And the last thing I want to explore with you is bridge. And
Hmm.
bridge is now, I mean, Tihar is, I don't know, is it a status symbol now? Or, what do you say? Because every second powerful man seems to have spent some time there. And how prison and how Tihar transforms bridge from this small man to this supposedly, man with influence and spreading his own version of this particular ideology in jail, in prison. Talk a little about Bridge.
Yeah, Bridge is a fascinating character because he is one of the people who's most out of touch with his own feelings in the novel. And he takes a kind of pleasure in sadism and in violence, right? And eventually, of course, he becomes one of the perpetrators of a true act of violence. And he ends up in jail. And even ending up in jail is kind of a victory because, in some ways, it seemed like he might be sentenced to death. And once he's in jail, because he is someone who has so badly wanted power all his life and not had it, as an English speaking man in prison who was formerly in the Air Force, he finds, oh, he can kind of be a father figure to a lot other convicts and kind of, teach them about the world, and, also pretends in some ways that he's gotten into yoga and into meditation, which were some of the things that were going on. And I think what I'm showing through him is a microcosm of what happens in the novel, which is that he appears to change outwardly, but you realize by the end of the novel, he's not actually changed very much. And unfortunately, maybe I have a slightly fatalistic view of people, which is that the core of people doesn't change very much. Like, the certain external trappings can change. And in my novels, I'm always showing how people grasp for change and then they lapse back into themselves. And that happens with Lakshman very much in this novel, where he seems to become slightly larger than just a mere predator. And then you see, oh, actually, this was who he was.
That's true of India as well. You may have just said
No, I
what's
think it's true
happening
of,
to the
I think it's,
country.
no, I agree. I think it's true of so many things, but it's, so the change is very gradual over time. Like, it's like, but I wish I could make a more intelligent comment about India as a whole. Probably not.
So is Deepak the one who gets away? I wonder what happens to him.
Someone else asked me that too, and it's making me feel I should write a novel about him because,
Yeah.
it's good
It'll
that
be the
that's being made.
first sort of franchise novel.
No, I actually had a part at one point where I talked a little bit about Deepak, and I sort of had a sad arc for him, which was that in my mind he'd ended up in the South, in the US, working married to an American woman, speaking with a full Southern accent, and running a car dealership. This idea that he had, kind of like Bridge, who is unstable, had reached for another identity to escape into, but one that was a kind of ill-fitting mask. So maybe I'll write my great Indian car dealer novel next.
And bring Malhotra back.
Oh, good. I'm glad you like, yeah, yeah. I did an event with my friend Anshul Malhotra, and I realized I was like, I'm running through all the Punjabi surnames one by one. So Cindy Malhotra was really fun to write. I mean, I
What
think
a fun character. What a fun character with all her different rooms and, that accent that doesn't slip and sometimes slips sometimes. But I think those are characters that you possibly need to explore in another novel.
good. Thank you. That's very inspiring to hear. She's also was fun to write because she also is performing a little bit, right? She's saying, I've changed my name from Simranpreet to Cindy. My husband's gone from being Veer to Val.
To Val.
But she's justifying herself a bit too much. She's saying, "Oh, we have become Americans. We are." But why does she have such a kind of like desire to extol that, right? And so I certainly could get into that in another longer piece or something.
Great. That'll be your great American novel.
It'd be
But
nice
thank
to
you
write
so
about
much,
America.
Karan. It's a delight to have read the book and a delight to speak to you. And I look forward to what you do next.
Thank you so much. It was so nice
Thank,
to meet you.
thank you.